Hey guys, this is James from James Films, and today I've got a bit of a different video for you. I've been getting a ton of requests to make a tutorial or a breakdown of one of my larger, more complex scenes, and I've worked on trying to get this into some kind of follow-along tutorial, but it's a little bit hard to start out. For now, I kind of want to make a longer, more fleshed out series, but for now I want to give you a bit of insight into my workflow, so I figured I would record a longer form video here. So I'm just going to have my screen recorder running, and I can show you how I made this really cool scene here, which I will pull up. I just made this yesterday afternoon, just as a bit of a relaxation. It's a nice, fun render, but there is quite a bit going on here, and I'd like to break this down for you and show you how I did it. So this is the scene in Blender, the finished scene. I will start a fresh one in just a second here, so you can see exactly how I build these from the ground up. But I mean, at a surface level, it's pretty simple. You don't have too much going on. If I go below my ocean plane here, you can see that there's a bit more going on underneath in order to get these more realistic looking rocks underneath the water. And then if I zoom in here, you can't see this right now in this view because I have it turned off, but if I go over, I use Graswald Pro. It's a really fun program to help scatter realistic nature assets in your scene. It comes with a bunch of pre-made ones, but you can also bring in other ones. I use Quixel a lot. They've got a lot of great assets here, so you can bring these in to your scene as well and scatter them on the surface in a couple different ways. Got like a lot of really great scattering growth options, which always work well. But yeah, so this is a different form video, and there will be timestamps on the YouTube description here and in the video that you can just skip ahead if you want to go to a specific section and learn about how I did a specific part of this. But let's just start this from the beginning. So here is the scene. We always start with the default cube. In this case, I'm actually going to get rid of this guy. I usually try to incorporate it into my architectural scenes, but for this one, I really don't need it. And to start the scene out, I actually want to go over to Quixel, where they've got like a lot of great assets like I was talking about. And there's a couple that I used for this scene in particular. These rock assets I thought looked pretty great. So let's just start with this guy, for example, the Icelandic lava spire. This syncs up really well with Blender. You can actually just export it directly, and then bam, your asset is already in your scene. And it's super easy to just move this around and populate your scene with it. A quick tip, if you don't want to bog down your scene with just a ton of extra geometry, extra polygons, what you can do is hit Alt-D, and that creates a linked duplicate that you can use, which is referencing this original one, which is great. Or if you want to do something a little bit different, sometimes what I'll do is make a new collection. Let's call this rock. And now you can go to Shift A and then collection instance, and you can instance that collection. I think I've talked about this in previous videos, but I usually like to do that a lot to reuse the same asset over and over again without adding too much extra geometry. So I'm just going to put this into my scene and kind of turn it a certain way that I like it. And I'm going to start to set up a camera angle even with just this limited amount of stuff. And if I reference what I did here before, you can see I kind of have this little bit of a low angle look over on this rock, and I'm going to hit Control-Alt-0, and it's going to snap my camera to this view. As I mentioned before, Instagram plays really well with 1200 by 1500, so I will set my resolution to that, drag out my viewport to show you a little bit more of what's going on. And then let's click on my camera, and then sometimes when you do Control-Alt-0, it messes up the rotation of the camera. In this case, it actually didn't. Surprisingly enough, sometimes this Y will be like tilted. Oops, it is actually maybe tilted. Let's see here. Yeah, there you go. The Y rotation is sometimes tilted. So I just like to fix that. And then I'm going to set a bit of a wider view for this. Let's say like 35 mil for the camera. Pull this in a bit, and then let's turn on composition guides. I think these are super helpful to get your scene looking really nice. You can see what that looks like. We have rule of thirds and center, I think, are my two favorite ones I use. So I usually like to line this up so that this takes up maybe about a third of the screen. There's going to be some stuff obviously on the ground here populating in my scene. I'm going to move this a little bit closer, maybe pull it down a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. So actually, let's just do Alt-D and then duplicate this guy, Let's scale it a little bit maybe, and then let's rotate it around so it is looking a little bit more unique than before. So now I've got this up against here, this kind of rock formation, and I'm going to bring in some rocks for the underwater part of this. And we can switch this over actually. Let's just start defining some lighting before we add some more stuff in here, just to kind of get an idea for where stuff is hitting in the scene. So this will take a second to load as it just processes the textures for those rocks. And now it is loaded. Let's just turn on ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and bring in an HDRI. And I've got these linked in the description if you want to use the exact same one that I used. I usually like to use this one from freehdriskies.com. I think it works pretty well. Gives me some nice lighting. And let's just drag this up here. Switch to the shader editor. Go to world settings, and then if you have node wrangler enabled, Control T will give you a nice mapping node connected to a texture coordinate node, and we can now rotate this around. And what I really liked was the light just perfectly hitting the edges of this rock. You can kind of see it just skimming that edge right there, giving it like a nice orange glow. And in the final image, that really read very well, I thought. We've got this nice glow on the edge there. So let's just play with that a little bit more. We can always revisit this in a second, a little bit later. And what I usually like to do is just amplify that setting a little bit more with a sun lamp in my scene. So let's just add in a sun lamp, and this is what's going to really give you that nice edge glow there. So if I rotate this up, and now angle it a little bit over to the side, you can see it's adding, if I really crank this up, you can see what it's doing. Let's add this to like 10 just so you see what we're doing. So we're adding like a nice edge glow to the rocks, which I think will look really nice. Case in point, I really like this orange glow. Obviously that color doesn't match with the HDRI as much. We don't have this random white spotlight. So I'm going to bring the saturation a little bit over here to the oranges. It should be enough. You don't want to go too crazy because you're going to get this like Mars looking effect. So just ever so slightly into the reddish orange channels here. And then let's take the strength back down to like 1, or it's not quite reading enough. Let's get it up to like 2. Maybe increase the saturation a little bit more. Okay, I think that's a good start. Again, we can always revisit this. I also really don't like this HDRI as the background, so let's just take that out for now and turn off the viewport overlays. So this is what our scene looks like so far. It's not much, but we are going to get to something like this in just a second. So I'm going to head back over here to Quixel again, and for the rocks you see under the water here, I'm going to use a scattering of this same plate here. And you'll be surprised, I literally used just this one plate for all of the rocks that are underneath this water. And it's very easy to do that because it's hard to tell what the difference is between things when you're looking at it at such a scale. Like when you keep duplicating the same thing over and over, rotating it slightly, scaling it slightly, it's hard for your eyes to tell that it's the exact same piece being just used over and over again. So what we're going to do is just use this to populate the scene. So I have this rock here. I'm just going to duplicate it again, Alt-D. Let's rotate it, scale it, kind of patch that corner there. That looks good to me. Let's duplicate it again, bring it over here, rotate, maybe scale it up a little bit. Z, rotate it again, duplicate again, patch this hole. This takes some time. I mean, just go through and do it. It really is not that difficult, but it will get a great result once you successfully patch up all the holes in your image. So I'm just going to start with just this for right now as my scene, which I think looks pretty good. So let's save this out too as a tutorial rocky scene. So this is what we have so far. And what I'm actually going to do is add in the water plane now. So I actually have been developing a couple different shaders that I use for my water in a lot of scenes. This one in particular is this kind of glassy one that I think I got from Blender Guru originally, and then I kind of modified the idea a bit. But the way you want to start with it, I'm going to actually use a plane for this because it's got some volumetrics based into it. So you'll see what this looks like in just a sec. So I want it to be around there. I think looks pretty good. We're going to call this my water plane. And let's just scale this up at like something crazy like 50 to really just take up the entire scene. And then make sure that my camera is not clipping, because sometimes that happens. It cuts off at 100 meters. Let's just crank this up to something crazy. And there you go. You can actually see that it was clipping a bit. So I'm going to name this our water planes. That's good. And let's just group these assets so that we don't get kind of stuck in the weeds looking through just tons and tons of layers. Let's call these tons of rocks. I don't know, just to get this out of the way, because I just think it looks a bit better. I'll call these side rocks. Let's make underwater rocks. That's a bit better. So I'm going to save this again. And then now I have a shader that I've been developing called Ocean Shader. And I might put this up somewhere. I believe this is from Blender Guru, if I'm not mistaken. But I've kind of modified it a bit to my liking. And it's a really simple one. So if I just bring this in, you can see this is what the ocean looks like. And then I'm noticing that the HDRI is actually projecting on our render. So I'm just going to switch to cycles really quickly just to see how this looks. And the shader, it's not too complex. There's just a bit of math going on with the light paths to make sure that this can actually be see-through. And you can kind of color it a little bit too. So I'm adding a bit of bluish turquoise tints to it. And then there's also this volume absorption, which is kind of helping with the depth. So as the deeper you get, the darker the water will get. And the further away you get, the darker the water will get as well. So what you're noticing is this HDRI is still reflecting in there. To get rid of that, go to the world settings, ray visibility, and then turn off glossy. And that will make your scene very dark for the reflections because nothing is currently reflecting off that anymore. So this is a good time to bring in the sky background that I used here. So if the mountains were like a key focal element of this piece, then it would be good to actually make these in something like World Creator, which I use quite a bit to make some really interesting displacements. And I've posted these in one of my previous tutorials before, where you can actually make really nice dunes, mountains, craters, volcanoes very quickly, procedurally as well, which is really nice. And then you get these nice displacement maps, like this is one that will correspond to a volcano. And you can bring these into Blender. This one is one that I used for kind of this funky mountain render I did a couple months back. But the thing is, these are very intensive for your viewport because there's a lot of geometry that you need for this displacement to make it look nice. So it's not a focal element of this piece, it's something way in the background. So there's no point really making this an actual 3D geometry. So instead what I'm going to do is actually use a 2D image just to really speed up my viewport, and it also will look much more realistic because you won't have somehow the add-on got disabled for images as planes. Just make sure that this is enabled. Go to your add-ons, images as planes. Somehow I disabled that one, not sure why. But yeah, so you'll have much faster render times without having all this extra geometry that you really don't need in the background. So I'm going to change that to emit. Go to my skies thing here. I've got a ton of images that I downloaded from Unsplash, royalty free. I'll link it in the description if you guys want to go and browse for yourselves. It's a really awesome site. Lots of really great images. And then the one I used for this was, it's like icy mountain image. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so I used Lake Mountains 1, this image that I got. So what I want to make sure is right about this image is that the plane of it is at the it's exactly parallel to the plane of this camera here. So I usually go to top view by hitting 7 on my numpad and then make sure that it aligns with my camera plane. Otherwise you'll get some kind of weird distortion and it will look just off to your eye. So let me zoom in a bit here just to make sure we're good. Yeah, so now that is exactly parallel to the plane of the camera, which is great. And I'm going to bring this way back in my scene and then scale this guy way up. And bring it up just a little bit here so that it is aligning with the crest of the water. Let's actually switch over to Eevee so we don't have this constant refreshing. If you have NVIDIA RTX graphics cards, which I don't currently have on my computer, you can do with the new 2.9 Blender this really great denoising, viewport denoising for cycles. Usually you have that in Eevee, it's an option you can check on and off. Doesn't really do too much, I feel like. But cycles, you really do notice it, so you're not looking through noise. It just will refresh your image very quickly, and looks great. But I currently am not rocking an RTX graphics card, so my viewport denoising, I have to opt for, if I were to go GPU compute, there's these different denoising settings, which one is automatic, which is okay. Optics is the one that's really great. It works with, oops, and it crashes my computer. This happens. See, yeah, I'm using an old system here, so I am going to be upgrading this soon, so I won't have to deal with that kind of crashing as much, hopefully. But you get the idea. You would be able to go over viewport automatic or open image denoise is the one that I use sometimes with the CPU. I like to use that sometimes with the renderer, which I think looks pretty good. You can also use optics, like again, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, but I usually do not use that, and I'm just going to be using the CPU for right now. It's not ideal, not as fast, I feel like, but it will get the job done. So you hear a dog barking in the background. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Eevee for a second here, just as I get my camera adjusted. Apologies for the background noise. So I will have to re-import that image as a plane for the background, and it was the mountain one, just like a mountain, Lake Mountains one. So this is the image. Let's once again make sure this adjusts with the plane of my camera. Looks about right to me. So that looks good. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back into my scene, scale it up like crazy again, raise it up. So that's good. And then scale up a little bit more. And then it's looking pretty good to me, I think. Maybe slide it over a little bit. Let's see what I did with this guy. Yeah, it looks pretty good. I'm showing a bit more sky this time in this render, but it's not the biggest deal. I think it looks pretty cool. So I save that out again. And then let's actually adjust this emission a bit, because I'm noticing it is not quite matching our HDRI as much. So if I were to go over to my shader here and just crank the emission up just a little bit, like 1.8 instead. So it's looking a little bit brighter, and I think that matches a bit better with our scene. So there's one more thing you can do with this plane too, to actually make the water look a little bit more realistic, is add in like a little bit of ripples to it. So the shader that I have actually has this noise texture baked into it, pumped into the displacement output of the water, but it's very subtle. And it's not really doing too much for me just now. So what I'm going to do is actually make, go into edit mode here and then just subdivide this plane just like a little bit. Just make it like a little bit of subdivisions like that. I don't think on the scale you'll really notice as much, but actually, yeah, you know what? Let's not do this. It's not going to work as much. I'm just going to focus on this guy. You can actually crank this way up here, and you can see that looks like choppy ocean. Which is like maybe a bit too much for a scene, but we can kind of play with this a bit, because I have this noise texture feeding into a math node, which is multiplying, and I'm kind of halving the effect of this, so I can actually bring this down like a little bit more, so the bump is not as severe. Maybe let's like just give it ever so slight. I want this to be a very calm lake, so you can see just ever so slightly these nice ripples in the water, and they kind of fade off nicely into the distance. So I can actually crank this noise texture up just maybe a little bit. Let's put it up to 2000 instead. I think that looks really nice. You can see this looks like natural water. You got these nice ripples to it. So something that happens in the reflections, I'll show you this in a second. Let's switch over to cycles. When you're reflecting this plane, you're going to have a little bit of an issue in the further back regions of it. It's a little bit hard to see here as this refreshes, but there's this kind of bizarre bright patch right here compared to this foreground element here. We don't really see that as much. It's the nice underwater part that you see. Let me just crop to just render region. So if I were to pull up this final image, you can notice this looks much better. There's not really that random bright patch there. And the reason you're seeing that is actually because I was a little bit lazy here to start, and I left this large patch open between the rocks in the foreground and the image plane where the mountain texture is. So what I need to do is actually fill out this little bit of range between the foreground and the background to kind of cut that off, so you don't have this bizarre random portion there. So if I were to actually disable the water, you can see what I mean. there's just this open part between here and the background that needs to be patched up. So I'm just going to switch this over to our regular view here again, solid view, and then let's just duplicate a few more of these guys, scale them way down in the Z so that they're not as extruded in the background, because I really don't want to cut this away too much. If I go to top view, you can see what this is looking like. It looks pretty good. Just doing some patchwork. This is like a lot of fun. I mean, I really enjoy filling out the scenes like this and just kind of making a realistic looking place and just kind of putting in all those details. You really respect just how detailed and complex nature is once you spend a little bit of time doing these renders. It's a real blast to do these, honestly. And you really notice a lot more stuff about the outdoors around you once you're looking around again. It's pretty cool. So let's put that water back in, and we have solved that problem, most likely. But there's one more problem that actually that has come up since adding in this image plane that we need to address. So now there's not that random bright patch, if you remember before, and this looks much more realistic. However, the scene looks a little bit dark, and you notice you don't have that edge light on the rocks, and that is because this image plane that we've put in here is actually somehow gone in this collection, is actually blocking the lighting that's coming in. So if you were to go to the Object Properties tab, Visibility, and then uncheck from Ray Visibility Shadow, that allows our sun lamp to work again and actually penetrate through this plane as if it's nothing, and not casting shadows from that plane on our scene. And now this looks much better. We've got a much more realistic looking scene. So this is like a little bit too bumpy still, I think, so let me just really pull this down, 0.005. I don't want this to be too intense looking. I want to be able to see all the rocks that are underneath, which I am actually much better able to see underneath, which looks really nice. And let me actually, just for now, take off this volume just because it takes a little bit longer to load. And it looks pretty good. So this is what we're working with so far. I think this is a pretty good scene, and it is pretty comparable to what we got as this final thing. However, this rock was maybe a little bit closer to the camera, so let's rearrange this a bit. And pull this over and maybe scale it up a little bit. And then turn this guy a little bit more, maybe bring him in a bit closer. Okay, so I think I basically completed the work for the water and for the rocks and everything in the background. So now I'm going to be adding in some nature to the scene, some plants, some grass, and a tree. So I often get asked how I do this. I don't actually make my own nature assets usually. I have done a couple photo scans in the past. However, it is extremely time intensive, and I recommend that you, if you can, try to leverage assets that are already available on the internet, because it will save you a ton of time and the result will look much better. So there are a lot of different things out there that you can use to do realistic looking nature assets. There's a couple of specific add-ons for Blender specifically, which I think work really, really well, and I've experimented with all of them, so I can kind of talk to the strengths and weaknesses of each one. But recently I've gravitated a lot to Graswald Pro. The Pro version gives you some really cool settings in terms of the physics of objects, which basically allows you to add in this noise displacement modifier. Apologies for the trash truck going outside. I'll pause for a second while you hear the wonders of the outdoors as the trash is slamming around. But what Graswald does is it allows you to very quickly add a system on something. It's their way of calling their particle system. So you add a particle system to any geometry. So in this one, I'm just adding it to this whole rock feature, and you just see a bunch of empty hair particles. And what you'll next want to do is create new settings, and that will put like just this kind of default representation of its particles on the system. And then you go to species, and you can choose from a number of different species that they already have preloaded, and then you can actually load in your own ones. Or what I like to do sometimes as well is actually use some assets, not from Graswald, but from something like Quixel, where Quixel's got a really great plant library. So let's, for example, go into here and let's pull some of this nice little plant right here. So I'll just export this to Quixel. It'll take, from Quixel to Blender. It'll take a second to load. And then once it's into Blender, the fun begins. So this will take a minute to load, and it is now loaded in. So let me just pull this out of this collection here and put it in the main one. So we have 12 different varieties of these plants. Let me just turn off rendered mode for a second, slowing down my viewport a lot. And I'm going to right click and then select hierarchy. So I've got all of these plant guys ready to go. And I'm just gonna move them out of my viewport for a second here, so they're not gonna be in the camera plane. I'm just gonna move them back here. I'm gonna hit M and then new collection. I'm just call these, I don't know, Quixel flowers example. So these are our flowers, and they're now in a collection called Quixel flowers example. So what I want to do now is, let me actually move these all out of the hierarchy that are coming in here. So, okay, so here's all our flowers. And I'm just going to move them out of my viewport here for a second. So we have all of these guys here. Zoom in and show you what we're working with. There we go. So these are the flowers that we have in our scene. And what I can do now is go to this rock, for example, and then under the collection tab, it's kind of a little bit hidden here. It took me a little while to figure out where this was at first. It's scattering a Graswald custom collection, which is including all of these kinds of guys. But I actually want to change this out to our Quixel flowers example. So if I select that, and then I'm just going to turn the density way down just to start here, so it's not going to bog down my scene when I open this up in the viewport. I can hit to show these in the viewport, and now you see it is scattering these flowers from Quixel. So that's really cool. And we can do a lot with this. But first, I actually want to add in kind of a grass texture, because right now I'm scattering this on a rock, and I feel like you don't really see plants or grass growing as much on rocks. It's kind of a little bit patchier. And what I wanted to have kind of happen is this little bit of a grass plot on both of these rocks where grass is growing, and not as much so in the rocks. So what I'm actually going to do for this is I'm actually going to delete this system, go back over to Quixel here, and then there is a nice moss asset. This one actually is one of the first ones that you can download. It's free when you open it up. I think a lot of these assets are now free if you have an Unreal Engine account, which I use Unreal Engine a bit, so I have these guys for free. So I'm going to import this moss into my scene, and then I'm going to pull it up a bit, and then rotate it a bit, rotate a little bit more, and I'm going to put this in material view just so I can see where stuff is overlapping in the scene. Okay, takes a second to load here. And while this is loading, I just want to thank all of you guys for following along. I just hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. It's quite an awesome amount of you guys already following along, which is really awesome. I'm so glad that you've joined along for this adventure. Hope you're learning something from these tutorials. I really enjoy sharing this stuff with you guys and getting your feedback on it and inspiring you to create your own pieces like this. It's a lot of fun. 3D is quite intimidating at first. I feel like even still now that I've been doing it for a couple years, there's still so much I have to learn, which is great because there is so much out there and the learning never stops. You can keep going, and it's just a blast. It's a lot of fun to learn this stuff, and I'm glad you guys are following along on this adventure of mine where I'm continuing to learn more and more. So this is loaded in now, and you can see what we're working with. We've got this grass moss here, and I'm actually going to just duplicate this guy, rotate him around, and bring him over to the other side here for this rock. And again, this just takes a little bit of time. Take your time placing these things. It'll really look nice in the end if you place it well. So here's what we're working with. We got these two grassy moss spots, and they look terrible right now, but give it a second, and a couple grass assets from Graswald will do the trick to make this look really nice. So I'm going to select this guy, go into Graswald Pro settings, create new settings, and now I'm going to use one of their built-in grass for this one. So let's use the orchard grass. So you can see it's using a kind of a low poly representation of what the grass would be to kind of save you some time in the viewport. So So I'm actually want to increase the density and then decrease the size. Let's bring this down to like 0.3 instead. I feel like that looks a little bit more reasonable, maybe even like 0.27 for the size. And what you can actually do here, I don't want this scattering like inside this rock because you're not even going to see these particles. I just want them to be scattered on this surface. And there's some great settings in here that you can actually use to optimize your scene and make sure that you're not showing particles where there really shouldn't be any, because it's just going to slow your renders down. The first one I like to use a lot is the distribution, and it actually allows you to do a custom weight paint density layer where you can scatter particles in just one specific place by painting over that section. So I'm just going to do some nice painting here on my scene. Anywhere where I think the grass will be visible, you can see from the camera view where this stuff will be scattering. And I'm just going to paint over all of this here. No reason to paint on the other side because there's not going to be a viewpoint over there that you're going to be able to see. And so this is basically good. Let's get a bit more down here. And just paint that guy in there, a little bit there, a little bit there. Okay, so that looks pretty great. So let's go back to object mode, and then I'm going to go to Graswald again. And then if you go back down here, recalculate density, it will scatter particles in just that one area, which is pretty awesome. I'm going to increase the density quite a bit for these guys because I want it to cover the entire surface area of my scene. And then what's great about Graswald too is when you adjust the size of the particles, it adjusts the density as well, the number of particles as well, so you're not having so many extra ones. It's all about optimization for Graswald, which is really great. I like that feature about it. I think it works really well for a lot of purposes. And so I'm going to switch back over to render view to show you what this looks like. So now this is actually going to show what the particles actually are in the scene. And it's these really cool, grass. And it'll take a second to load here. And while it loads, we will just be patient again and relax. So this is really cool. Once it actually shows, the suspense is incredible. We'll see how this is in just a second. Again, I always say this in my videos too, 3D is all about patience and slowing down and taking your time. There's a lot of stuff that really will slow down as you're working through the process, and it kind of gives you just a chance to take a break and not just be trucking so quickly through something, so you can kind of take a look at the whole scene and really see what's working, what's not working, maybe even come back to the next day and see what you might have missed in the first pass through it. So it's a lot of fun, and it does take some time, it does take some patience, and now that patience is paid off and we have a scene that is loaded in. So if I turn off this in the viewport, I'm going to save this again just so that we have that loaded in. I'm going to do some material work in a Graswald on this grass particle. So with Graswald's grass, they actually come with a pre-built texture that you can actually adjust in the material settings in Graswald, which I really like as well. And specifically, you can adjust the age. So if I were to push this over to the right further, it would look a little bit more yellow, a little bit more dead. You can also change the translucency of it, so like how much light is passing through it, and it makes it shinier or not as shiny. And the one I'm going to adjust for this scene is the wetness, which will actually add in a little bit of these kind of water particles, like almost like dew, like morning dew on the grass. So if I were to zoom in a bit here, you can really see it. You got these like water particles on the grass, which look really nice. And currently you're not really seeing that as much over here. And I want to have that look really nice, like it's a morning view of this place. So I'm just going to crank this up like quite a bit, and you'll see what this does to the grass. It's got this nice dewy wetness to it. I'm going to increase the translucency just a little bit so they're a bit shinier. And that's looking pretty great. It's taking a second to load, but you can already see it's getting closer to that really nice dewy look that I had over here before. So I'm going to close out of this for a second. This is going to be going a bit slowly, so apologies for that. But yeah, so that's the scene for that right part. And I'm going to do the same thing and add this over to the left side of my image. But first I'm just going to disable this particle system so it's not bogging down my scene as much. Go over to solid mode again. And then actually let's go to material view. You can even do this in Eevee too. Sometimes I'll just start working Eevee if I already know what the lighting looks like, and then come back to cycles for like the final render, just because it will be much slower operating in cycles. Case in point, it's a little bit slow right now as I'm moving between viewports. This is all part of the process. You kind of learn as you go, and again, you take your time going through these, since it is not always the most efficient thing. Okay, so we're over here in materials view. I'm just gonna again put this over to Eevee. Let's go to render just so we see what we're working with particle-wise. So I'm gonna be workshopping that left side of the image over here. So I'm gonna select this guy and then add in a new particle system, create new settings, and I'm gonna use that same grass as before, the orchard grass. So again, it's scattering all over my thing, which I don't want. And so I'm actually going to go back down here, density, create a group, turn on my viewport display here. And let's see here. Should we get rid of this? Create a new group. There we go. Okay, it was somehow still using the vertex group from the other one, which I didn't want as much. So let's just paint over this stuff here. And that's looking pretty much good. Maybe put a little bit more on this northern edge, and a little bit here. Okay, let's go back to object mode, and then I'm going to recalculate that. Calculate density. Okay. And it only has like one particle, so it's not really doing too much from here now. So I'm going to put this back down to 0.27, and then now you can see how this works. So it's looking pretty great. So I kind of know what this looks like already, so I'm just going to disable this and then add in one of the last couple features here is a tree. So if you remember in this guy, we had a nice tree in that scene right there, and a chair. So we're going to add in those two last ones. So I'm going to go to something called Botanic, Botan IQ. They've got a bunch of great tree assets that I use for a lot of my renders, which I think are pretty great. And I'm going to be using a deciduous tree, which I believe the one I used was a little bit further down here. You can see all the different varieties of these trees, quite a few really cool ones. I think these all work really well in the scene in general. They light very well. They look pretty cool when you're putting them in your scene. I believe I used, I think the linden one here, if I'm not mistaken. Doesn't really matter. A lot of these I think look pretty comparable. So let's add this one in here. It's a little bit large to start out, so I'm just going to resize him, pull him up, and then I'm going to move him over to this mossy patch on the right side of my frame. So let's angle him a little bit too. This looks pretty cool. And then turn off the overlays. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much what I want for that one. Maybe let's turn a little bit more so you can see the trunk a bit better. So that looks pretty great. And then I'm going to add in the chair too, which the chair model you can actually get from a site called 3dsky.org. They have a bunch of both free and paid models that you can use for your scenes. I'll link this again in the description, as well as all the other add-ons and stuff I use. I have a nice page linked with everything. So yeah, there's like a lot of different assets that you can use from here, from anything from dressing tables to musical instruments to TVs, whatever. Lots of great 3D models. I think they're pretty high quality. A lot of them are designed more so for 3DS, or sorry, for what's some of the other softwares like I don't know, Cinema 4D or other things. They come as like Max files or these other file extensions. Usually ones I look for when I'm downloading it are .fbx ones, which are pretty good, or OBJs with the materials included. And then usually I'll have to spend a little bit of time cleaning the models up to make sure that they work properly in my scene. Just get them looking okay, because sometimes they don't always come out of the box looking perfect for the scene. And you'll see what I mean once you start experimenting around with them a bit. They don't always work as well. But for this one, I've got this chair model that I used, and I'm just going to pull it directly from the blend file from before, because there's no point in you watching as I go through and make this happen, just because it's a little bit boring. It's just a matter of messing around with nodes and getting stuff working, and it's just like little tweaks to like the saturation or to the bump or... Okay. So that's loading a bit too slowly, so I'm just going to import this a different way as a FBX. I have these in my models. Plastic, chair, blue. And that's why it wasn't showing up, because it's a different name. All right. So I imported this in. I've already cleaned this model up a bit before in the past, but this one's a pretty good model. It's like a nice, like, kind of plastic deck chair, like beach chair or whatever. I feel like I used to sit in these a lot when I was like at the beach when I was a kid, or like at a party. Like you pull these over to the table. I think it just looks like a good chair. It's quite nice. So I'm gonna go in. It's a very simple thing here. It just has a little bit of color to it, like kind of like a plastic shader. I'm just gonna adjust the color a bit so that it's like this just plain white deck chair color. So it looks pretty nice. And then what I'm going to do is make sure that this is aligned with the rocks below here, so it's not just like floating in the water, floating in the air, which could be possible, but let's make it look a little bit more realistic and scale it up a little bit. And so it's sitting in the water like a chair should be. So that's looking a bit better. I'm going to pull up these rocks a little bit so that they're aligned with the base of this chair. So that's looking a bit more reasonable. So yeah, that is basically the scene. There's one more thing I forgot to mention about the renders here to really improve the quality of your render, and that is before you render. I'm just in a default scene here, so just ignore that for now. But if you go over to the view layer properties, make sure to check in mist for the passes, a mist pass. And then once your render is rendered out, you can go over to the compositing, use your nodes, and then if you hit Control, Shift, and click on this, you will have an image here, and then you'll have the ability to plug in the mist channel. So you'll be able to put that into the image and then export that out. And there's a couple ways to actually change this. So if I were to just go back over to the layout here, for example, and let's go, one of these is the camera view. I'm just gonna talk about how this works. So if I just bring my camera down here, and let's just angle this at 90 degrees, just to show you what this effect's looking like. So if I just, let's just duplicate this box like a whole bunch of times in the scene. Put this one over here, scale it up, duplicate this one, put this even further back in the scene. Just like have a whole bunch of these in the scene somewhere. Just to illustrate what this is doing. So we've got a whole bunch of these boxes in the scene, and let's show you how this works. So these are all separated in 3D space. You can see our cameras here, and these are all in different regions. So when you have the mist pass enabled, you can go back over into your camera, if you click on your camera, and scroll down all the way down to your camera guy here, open data properties, hit viewport display, and then now you can actually show the mist in the screen. And what that's going to do is it shows you this line, and this is where it's actually clipping for your mist pass. So if I go over to rendered view now and click on the drop down for shading of render view, and instead of showing the combined render view, show the mist pass. And so you can see what it's doing actually. It is anything that's really close to the camera is really dark contrast, and then anything that's further and further back away is really bright white. So it's actually clipping, like the whitest portion of this image is at this distance from the camera, is this point right here. And the darkest point is at this point closest to the camera. And the way to affect that is actually in your world settings. So if you click on the world settings, and it's in here, it's mist pass. If you click on mist pass, you can see it's starting at 5 meters. So if you want to start that a bit closer, you can pull that a bit closer, and you can see it's actually already fading that guy out a bit. If you want to start a bit later, so let's have this cube be the darkest portion, you can start it there. And then I want this to go really far back so you can see everything in the screen. So that is where it is ending now. So you have this stuff really far back here. And if you were to pop this render off really quickly, let's just render this scene. So you can see this is what that looks like as a rendered scene. And if I were to go over to the compositing, you can see this is what the scene looks like. It's this really dark contrast scene. But if I were to plug in my mist pass into the image, you can see that's what it looks like. And you can actually export that out. And what I recommend doing that for landscape scenes, you have atmospheric scattering, atmospheric fall off. The further away you get away, the further away you are from the camera, the more kind of low contrast and washed out the image is going to look. If you just look at any photos of nature, of real nature, that's what you see. You're going to see this kind of fading off effect into the distance of the atmosphere. And that's just the nature of just how light scattering works in the real world. So you want to mimic that, and it really will add a bit of realism to your render. So I did that actually for this render that I popped off. So I have two different views. I have this chair mist passed here, and you can see what it's doing. So this dark region is the chair and some of the foreground and some of the rocks and stuff here. And the further away you get, the lower contrast it gets. And this is the actual render that came out directly from Blender. It looked like this. So what I want to do is actually composite these two together in post-processing. So I'm just going to start anew with these scenes and kind of walk you through my process. So this is the scene that I actually ended up coming up with. This is the final image, and I can kind of walk you through the layers here in Photoshop that I did. It's a pretty simple breakdown here, just to kind of add some contrast and adjustments to my image. So this is the original image right out of Blender, and I've composited in that mist pass, and you can see what effect that really has. It's kind of adding in that nice atmospheric fall off to the image. And the way I did that is actually by having this as a blend mode, setting it to screen, and then adjusting the opacity. So if it's full opacity, it's a little bit way too washed out for me. So I just brought this back just enough so that it would look acceptable in the screen. So that's what I ended up looking with as the final image. I wanted to brighten up this horizon just a little bit more, so I added in a brightness and contrast, just added the brightness up a little bit more, and then just dragged across right as at the point where the ground meets the sky, or where the water meets the mountain rather. I added in a lens flare to this, just to add in just a subtle brightness to the edging of the rocks coming in. Added in a levels to add in a bit more contrast, and what I usually like to do is pull down the rightmost edge of this, which is the brightest parts of the image, and makes it like a little bit brighter, a little bit more washed out there. And then usually to compensate, we'll push the mid levels up just a little bit to add in like a little bit more contrast to the image isn't getting so washed out. And then also you can pull up the shadows just a little bit here so that it's darkening the blacks just a little bit more, which looks nice with the levels. And so I also went to the hue and saturation and then just kind of added a little bit more to the reds of the scene, which is this edging of the rock, which I thought would look really nice. And the way you can actually do that is by using a targeted adjustment in Photoshop. So if you click on this hand, this finger pointer thing here, it gives you an eyedropper, and you can click on a specific part of the region. So if I click on this, it says that, okay, this is cyans, and you can just drag this to the left and right to increase the saturation of that specific thing. So I'm just going to leave that as is because I don't really need it to be super saturated for the mountains. So I just did some adjustments, targeted adjustments that way. I added in a color lookup just to add a little bit more orangish to this, and what I did for that one is add in, there's a nice LUT that comes with Photoshop called Fall Colors. So I added that look in, and then I just did some dodging and burning just to add in a little bit more contrast to, or a little bit more brightness to some of these highlights of the image. The last thing I did was actually add in this filter, which comes with something called the Nick collection, and I've linked to this in the description as well. It is a really great post-processing software that you can use. I think it's from Google originally, and it allows you to do some really cool effects. So I just did some adjustments to really add some kind of dreaminess to the image and do some saturation and color adjustments. And then this is the final image that I got to. So from humble beginnings to this, it looks really cool. A lot of fun to make this. So if you found this format helpful, enjoyable, please let me know in the description. I'll try to make more of these in the future if you guys like these. I feel like the longer breakdowns and the kind of workflow process videos are very helpful to see, just because it shows you exactly what the creator is doing. I definitely learn a lot from watching other people's workflows, even if you're not actually following along piece by piece. It's just helpful to see what other people are doing, how they're thinking through problems, how they're adapting, how they're adjusting things, what they're using. So hopefully this was enjoyable to you. If so, please subscribe for more, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thank you for tuning in.